So I'm going to start with one of my favorite scenes in the book, and it's near the beginning of Kerris' introduction. This begins halfway through the scene in the book, but because of time, I wanted to get to the main part. So, background, when the book opens, Kerris and her brother live with their aunt and uncle and cousin, who is a female cousin. And Tynan, her brother, has been more or less adopted as the uncle's successor and is treated very well, more as a son than as a nephew. And Kerris kind of feels like he has abandoned her, like he doesn't take care of her as her closest family relative, as well as he should. Kerris is 21 years old and is more or less considered a spinster. They have more or less written her off as a lost cause. They're not going to be able to marry her off anybody. She's idealistic and bullheaded, and they don't quite neglect her, but they don't treat her very well, and it's pretty clear that she's the least valued member of the household. And I should note that when the scene opens, she's wearing a really, really god-awful ugly dress, and it's a hand-me-down from her aunt that's been altered, and it's not in style, and it's the wrong color for her, and so it makes her look really sick and kind of gross. And so she's like, oh, I have to go to this dinner, and I look awful, and then they have a visitor. So here we go. We descended the central staircase, passed through the grand entrance hall, and into the blue drawing room. Lenora stood at the window, looking out on the courtyard, framed by the Everian lace, just as I had left her earlier that afternoon, though of course she wore a different gown for supper. She turned when she heard the firm click of Tynan's boots on the parquet floor. I thought I saw concern flicker across her face when she saw me, but it was just the precursor of her usual displeased frown. I maintained my calm expression, biting the tender flesh of my cheek to distract myself from the urge to say something rude. Lenora had no right to express displeasure over the clothing she provided for me. It wasn't as if I had money to buy anything for myself. I swallowed the burning sense of injustice and turned my attention to the rest of the room. My uncle, Lord Braden, head of Seton Hill House, sat in his wingback chair next to the fire and glowered at his daughter. Ariana sat on the chaise, arrayed in a dusky blue gown trimmed in ivory lace. She leaned toward the man who sat in a chair next to her and laughed at something he said, seeming enraptured. Her dark blonde hair and peach-toned skin glowed, and her curvy figure looked perfectly natural in the elaborate dress. I was plain and short, with no womanly figure to speak of, and to be honest, little desire for one, except when I was forced to stand next to Ariana and endure the inevitable comparisons. Though she was born 5 years after me, strangers invariably assumed I was the younger cousin. Before I had an opportunity to see more of the visitor, Ariana caught sight of me. "Cousin Kerris," she said, in a tone much too loud and cheerful for the small room. "What a lovely dress you're wearing tonight. It reminds me very much of one of my mother's old favorites." I bit harder on my cheek. Before I could give in to the temptation of responding, Tynan drew me forward and cleared his throat. "Sir, please allow me to introduce my sister, Lady Kerris." The visitor, who had turned toward us at Ariana's outburst, stood and bowed the waist. "Kerris, this is Carrick of Shaymore House," Tynan said. "He has driven our uncle and me a hard bargain for a new trade agreement, but I believe we may reach an accord before his visit ends." "A pleasure," Kerrick said. He stretched his lips in a smile, but no sign of pleasure reached his flat green eyes. His dark hair was pulled back severely and tied with a ribbon in the same blood red as his tunic. The style accentuated his hard features. His cheekbones were high and sharp, his chin rather pointed and his nose too thin. His skin was waxy pale, as if he rarely spent time outdoors. I guessed he was 34 or 35 years old, and between the heavy ring on his right hand and the expensive cut of his clothes, probably the eldest son of Shaymore House. I wished for a moment that I had paid better attention to my lessons on Syrian nobility and politics. I disliked him immediately, but I bowed my head and curtsied, not quite trusting myself to say anything. Tact was never one of my strengths. Not that there was any immediate benefit for me in pretending to be a polite, proper young lady, but it would save me trouble later. If Kerrick had come to negotiate a trade deal, my uncle wouldn't tolerate anything he saw as a threat to Seton Hill House's prosperity. Based on 13 years of experience, that included almost anything that came out of my mouth. Tynan, dear, see how much embroidery I've finished today. Ariana rose and brought her sewing hoop to show us. I couldn't tell whether she wanted to impress my brother and our visitor, or whether she just hated to be removed from the center of attention. A footman appeared at the door just then and announced that supper was served. Nora turned away from the window and accepted my uncle's elbow as he led the way to supper. Kerris offered his arm to me, and there was no polite way to refuse him. When I laid my hand in the crook of his elbow, a voice rumbled at me, "Be wary." For a moment, I thought Tynan had spoken, and I turned to look at him, puzzled. But he was busy cajoling Ariana into following the rest of us into the dining room. No one seemed to have heard anything. "Miss Kerris." Kerris covered my fingers with his own, and I fought the urge to snatch them away. "Is anything the matter?" I blinked and shook my head. Perhaps I shouldn't have allowed myself a nap that afternoon. No, only a momentary lapse. I drew in as deep a breath as I could manage inside my corseting. "Please, let us proceed." Kerris didn't adjust his stride for my shorter legs, though my head barely came to his shoulder, and I was forced to hurry my steps to keep up. By the time he pulled out my chair at the table, I was grateful to collapse into it, trying to slow my quick, shallow breaths before Nora noticed. I smoothed the ugly skirt over my lap while Kerris took the seat to my right. I felt his oily gaze on me, and my sense of unease grew stronger. One of the footmen served the soup course, beginning with Brayden and Nora at opposite ends of the table. Kerris leaned toward my uncle. "Your niece doesn't resemble your description at all, if I may be so bold, Lord Brayden. It's clear from her darkened skin that she spends a great deal of time outdoors, but she seems otherwise well-mannered." "Give her time," Brayden said. Heat blossomed in my cheeks. That my uncle had discussed my personal foibles with a business partner was embarrassing enough, but it was unthinkable for Kerris to unearth the subject in company, and for Brayden to reply as if I had no ears to hear him speaking right in front of me. Ariana leaned across the table and whispered while Kerris' attention was still on my uncle. "What's this, Kerris? Embarrassed? I should think after all your foolishness, you might expect my father to warn his guests about you." "He should warn them about you, Ariana. At least I don't alter my personality to wring advantage from everyone I encounter." Tynan glared at me. "That is a skill you might do well to cultivate more, sister. You will not always be among people who indulge your childishness." As usual, his disapproval quelled my temper, and I concentrated on the meal. Kerris made no attempt to draw me into conversation, but remained absorbed in his discussion with my uncle and Tynan through the next two courses. I ignored Ariana's taunts and the warning looks Aunt Nora bestowed on me with every course, as if she expected me to show my true color by licking the polished silver platters. The main course was laid. The servant placed my plate last, as usual, and gave my shoulder a quick, reassuring squeeze while the others weren't looking. His brotherly touch drew my wandering attention back to the dining room, and I caught the thread of the men's conversation. "She will need a new wardrobe, of course, if she's to live in Elton year-round," Kerris said. "But otherwise, I must say I'm rather disappointed. She does not at all live up to my expectations for a wife." Shocked, I stared at Ariana. She returned my gaze with a smug smile, as if she hadn't a care in the world that the men were discussing her marriage over supper. I forgot myself. Leaning forward, I interrupted Brayden's reply. "You cannot expect Ariana to marry this man, Uncle. She's only 16 and not eligible until next year." Silence fell, with me at its center and focus. I couldn't read Kerris' expression, but Brayden's was heavy with disgust and disapproval. Tynan looked like he thought he hadn't heard me correctly. I didn't have to look at Nora to feel her grin frown. Then Ariana laughed. "Dear Kerris, you're too funny. Of course I won't wed Kerris. Have you forgotten that I'm to marry Tynan? If I don't, the whole estate goes to some distant cousin when father dies. And as you say, I'm too young." She leaned forward, every eye and ear trained on her. "You really must pay better attention when you're married, cousin. Something like this might be considered an unforgivable lapse from a hostess." Once again, I stared at her in shock as the full import of her words took root. They weren't discussing her impending marriage, but mine. Kerris' gaze met mine when I turned, and his expression, which I thought so unreadable moments before, was predatory.